Howdy folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound for the Old West with a look at Louis L'Amour's very first ever Western story, The Town No Guns Could Tame, which first appeared in the pages of the premiere issue of New Western magazine with a cover date of March 1940. This is an offering of mine to Michael K. Vaughan's June on the Range, his BookTube event that is held every year at this time, encouraging all of us on BookTube here to be reading and chatting about Westerns, the grand old genre that once ruled the plains. And he's got quite a posse of co-hosts. I'll leave links to his channel and his co-host channel in the notes down below. So that if you're a Western fan, you should check them out. I'm not a co-host, just a lifelong fan of Western fiction, and so I'm hitching a ride here to the wagon train and realizing that I've been burning daylight here. We're nigh on to the end of June, as they say, and so I'm going to scramble here and try to get this video posted before sundown and see if we can take care of that before the cows come home. So, all right, without further Western parlance, let's chat about Louis L'Amour's very first Western story here, and then we'll wrap things up with looking at a couple of illustrations that were created especially for the story. But before we do that, let's kind of flip back through the calendar a little ways here and see how the town No Guns Could Tame became Louis L'Amour's very first Western. And since I've never chatted about Louis L'Amour on my channel here before, maybe a good place to start is to find out how Louis L'Amour became Louis L'Amour. Well, he was born in 1908 in Jamestown, North Dakota, where he grew up haunting the public library, where he fell in love with reading books of all kinds. Then in the winter of 1923, thanks to a lot of post-war rural bank failures, his family took to the road to work odd jobs across the southwestern United States. And when he was 15, Louis struck out on his own to find work wherever he could. And during all that time, he was always packing books with him or picking up and reading any books that he could find along the way, which were fairly random, and yet he would read anything. Through the 1920s and 30s, he hoboed his way across the Southwest, and he worked as a miner, a boxer, a ranch hand, lumberjack, longshoreman, and even as a circus worker. And he was also a merchant seaman for years and years, which took him all over the world. Now, all along the way, Louis was meeting with and traveling with and working with and living with people from all kinds of adventurous lives. And as they were working together and traveling together and such, they would tell stories. They'd share their own experiences. And these were people that Louis was meeting from a wide range of ages. There were a lot of young men his own age. He was just in his late teens himself at the time, all the way up to pretty old men who had memories of their days and experiences, remembering back to the actual days of the Old West in the 1870s and 80s. And they were still working and telling stories. And Louis would always sit and listen with fascination and with respect, with genuine respect. And he just loved hearing all these stories, personal exploits, understanding that there were some tall tales thrown in there and all that, but it was just great storytelling. And as he was traveling, once he was especially traveling around the world, he was meeting people from all walks of life and all kinds of past adventures and things. And the whole time he was reading. So he was getting stories from just classic literature, anything he could find, as well as everybody he was meeting, sharing all these stories. And he was gaining a lot of his own experience and living a bit of a rough and tumble life and having some close calls and things. And so that's what adventure comes from. And at one point, he started to think, maybe it might be a little easier life and maybe more profitable if he wrote about these adventures rather than living them. He came to the belief that adventure was kind of a romantic word that really meant trouble. So he thought he would try his hand at writing his own adventure story. So he started to do that. But he didn't really feel like he knew what he was really doing. He didn't have an education in writing at all. Lots of experience in reading and sharing stories with real people and real experiences and all that. Writing was another story, you might say. And so he was struggling with that. He did manage to sell some poetry here and there and get a couple of assignments writing sports articles for some local newspapers during his travels. But his adventure stories were not selling until 1933. He managed to sell a story. Now, I shouldn't say sell a story, but it was intended to sell a story. It was called Death Westbound. And it was a story about hobos riding the rails during the Depression and getting into trouble. Naturally, having adventures. So that was actually his very first published story. Now, if you look at most bibliographies, will give the credit to another of his stories called Anything for a Pal, which appeared in a magazine called True Gang Life magazine, which was cover dated October 1935. Often given the credit for being his first published story. However, the first published story was Death Westbound, but it doesn't get the credit it deserves as far as that goes for a couple of reasons. One is that the magazine that it appeared in, 10-story book, went out of business before they ever cut a check for Louis L'Amour, and so he just didn't get paid. So technically, his first professional publication, his first story, was that second story, Anything for a Pal, because they actually paid him. But the other reason that the first story didn't really get the credit it might have been due, the 1933 story, is because it appeared in that magazine. 10-story book was an embarrassment to Louis. 10-story book was primarily a girly magazine that featured photography of scantily clad ladies or outright nudes. This is the March 1933 cover here of that esteemed journal, which carried L'Amour's very first published short story, Death Westbound. And today, this is an extreme rarity amongst Louis L'Amour collectors. And as an avid Louis L'Amour collector myself, I've never come across an issue of that magazine for sale anywhere. But I promise you, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to get my hands on one of those. I'll keep you posted. Now, his first professional sale of Anything for a Pal in 1935. For the next 5 years after that, Louis L'Amour managed to sell another 10 or 11 stories to various pulp magazines. And none of them were Westerns. They were crime or detective stories. There were some sea adventures and then some boxing and sports yarns. But a lot of sea adventures, actually. No Westerns. And then in late 1939, there was a pulp magazine company called Popular Publishers. They were trying to break into this growing market of the cheaper pulps, the dime pulps they were called. They were printed on much cheaper paper, if such a thing was possible. Very rough and ragged. They didn't pay their authors as much. They didn't give credit to their artists, those kinds of things. So they were able to sell these magazines a lot cheaper and make more money in a cheaper line. And they were going to launch this particular line of magazines under the imprint of Fictioneers Incorporated. And Louis L'Amour, never having written a Western, saw this as an opportunity that he could kind of break into, because they needed new names, new Western authors, and so he could be one of those. So he wrote a Western and sent it in, and they bought it. Here's the cover of that first issue of New Western Magazine, the March 1940 issue, which inauspiciously carried the very first Louis L'Amour Western story. L'Amour's name was still mostly unknown, and even at that, he was not associated as a Western writer. So he's not mentioned at all on the cover. And in fact, his story doesn't even appear until page 94 of a 112-page magazine. New Western was a budget pulp from the ground up, so no artists are credited anywhere in the issue. Anonymous artists were just cheaper. Now, you might know this about me already, but I love talking about artwork. And this illustration on the cover here has nothing to do with Louis L'Amour's story in the magazine at all. But I wanted to find out, if I could, the name of the artist that at least painted the cover here. And I was able to find out that it was Tom Lovell. And I discovered that because I found that the cover art was repurposed from an older magazine, Ace High Westerns, that had come out in August of 1937. That art had already been paid for, and the publisher could cheaply repurpose the art. They changed a little bit of the background. They added in that western town behind them, whereas in the original issue it was a different, more obscure background. But in that Ace High Western issue, they did give credit to Tom Lovell for the art on the cover. Such were the economics of pulp magazines back in those thrilling days. And that's the story of where Louis L'Amour came from and where his first Western story came from. But what about the story itself? So let's chat about that now. I've just read this short story for the first time. Often when I do these videos, I like to start at the beginning. And in this case, for Louis L'Amour, his first Western for June on the Range, obviously here, was a short story that I had never read. I've read a lot of Louis L'Amour novels in my time, but really none of the short stories. So starting with this one, I know he had written 10 or 11 stories before this, or had published before this, which I have not read either. So I don't know how good of a storyteller he was from the get-go and how much he improved up till the point where this Western story was published. I don't know that. I can tell you that the story is a pretty standard Western tale. It's a story of an outlaw who has been unjustly accused and is now trying to move on under a new identity, and comes to a town as a miner. He's working now as a miner, and he is approached to clean up the town because there's some sketchy people now pulling some hijinks and things. So they hire him as the marshal, not knowing that he may possibly be the outlaw that they are worried is coming to town to lead a gold heist or other things going on. So that's kind of the broad setup here. But other than that, reading it, like I say, it's a pretty standard fare. But boy, what a rip snorter of a story it is. It really keeps you turning those pages. And I just have to say that if this is Louis L'Amour just 10 short stories into his career, I don't know how good those stories were before that, but this is an indication he's just a natural born storyteller. And I that's my sense. I'm going to go back and have to read some of those other stories to see if that's true. But this particular story itself really pulls you in. And it's a simple story, but there's a lot of action and adventure, of course. But he puts you in the mind of his protagonist here. His name is Clip Haynes. He's the guy, the new guy in town here who gets hired as a marshal, and he's got this checkered past that he's trying to put behind him and hopefully someday redeem his name. So he comes to town under an assumed name, gets hired as a marshal, and right away there is the murder of a young boy, which is rather tragic. And of course, he is suspicioned of being behind that. But this is his first job as a marshal, and he's going to solve it. We don't go too much into the background of what he had done or what he's suspicioned of having done as an outlaw in the past. It's not important to the story, just that he does have this background that he's trying to live down and, turn a new leaf in some place where he's not known. But there is that murder right off the bat. There's a gold heist in the works. There are other things going on. There's a beautiful woman involved, of course. Can you trust her? Is she trustworthy or not? We don't know. Lots of twists and turns in the story, and you really get inside Clip Haynes's head as he's trying to puzzle his way through solving the murder and the gold heist and who's behind all of this. Who can he trust? Who can't he trust? And that is what captivates you as a reader. There are some surprises. Louis L'Amour is throwing in a lot of twists and turns to keep you turning those pages. I don't know how clever they are, but they're compelling, and it just keeps you turning those pages, like I say. There is one big surprise at the end, which I don't know if you can see it coming or not. Personally, it's such a short story, and I was reading it so quickly and just going from page to page to page that I wasn't really looking for a big twist at the end. I don't know how big of a twist it is, but it was a satisfying, kind of a moment. Doesn't really involve the action in the story so much, but it solves a relationship, so to say. I'll just leave it at that. But I can heartily recommend reading this story. So any Louis L'Amour story I've ever read has always been very satisfying. There's some that are better than others, of course, but none of them leave you feeling disappointed, really. So this is right in that ballpark, right off the get-go as far as his Westerns go. Very proud of Louis L'Amour. So, okay, now let's kind of round things out here by looking at these two illustrations here that were created specifically for the story, The Town No Guns Could Tame. We'll start off with the artwork for the story from New Western magazine from March of 1940 by an uncredited staff artist. I tried to find out who the likely artist here was, just like I was able to find out for the cover artist from the front of New Western magazine. But I failed you completely in identifying the artist here, which is really a shame because it's a great example of the type of black and white interior pulp art from the era. And I talk about these kinds of things a lot. It's just a kind of artwork that's been mostly lost over the decades. If a short story or any kind of a story from these old magazines ever does get reprinted, you rarely ever get to see the artwork that was created in the first place for it. A lot of times you'll get new artwork, but some of this great old artwork is just lost and we never get to see it. So that's why I enjoy sharing it. This is the kind of artwork that is often laid out to allow type and headlines to wrap around all the details of the drawings, and really gave these old magazines that kind of organic charm that we just don't see much anymore. Nowadays, we see a lot of stock art or photography or things to illustrate a piece of fiction in a magazine, if you even come across fiction in magazines much anymore, or even come across magazines much anymore. But it isn't generic art either. These kinds of drawings were created from scenes right out of the story. Usually the artist would actually read the story, or if not, then specific details might have been given by an art director or sometimes by the author, him or herself. In this case, the detail of the story here is we see Joe and Gonnie, the Barlow brothers. They're the ones that are standing up on the porch there of the hotel, and we see Clip Haynes down there in the street, looking a little worse for wear. This is the scene of the final showdown here, and Haynes has already caught a white-hot bullet in his left arm, causing him to drop that gun from his left hand, and now he can only fire with the gun in his right hand. And if we're going to pick a little nit here, I like to do that. I wonder why we see just his cartridge belt, no holsters at all. That seems odd. He should be wearing two holsters. He's been packing a 6-gun on each hip through the whole story here, and even in this shootout here, he's using 2 guns. But did the holsters get shot off or something? It seems like an odd omission, but we just don't see the holsters here. But Haynes in the showdown catches another bullet in his side this time, while somehow he's manages to keep firing at the Barlows. And then he felt a slash across his ribs. And then he saw Gonnie Barlow's gun fire right into his face, and he feels a terrible blow on the side of his head, and then everything goes black. And I will just leave the results of that big shootout for you to read. But what's this down in the lower corner here? If there wasn't enough action already in the main drawing, we get a smaller little vignette of a fist fight. That's a bar fight in the saloon. Happens earlier in the story. The big guy there is Porter, and he ran with the Barlow brothers. He was a mean SOB, but he was more of a fist fighter than a gunman. This was a pretty short barroom fight, right out of any Western movie or TV show you might have seen. But as big and powerful as Porter was, Haynes was quicker. And so L'Amour tells this little scene here pretty well, and it's pretty funny, actually. A lot of action, like I say, in the story, and a lot of little plot twists throughout, lots of fun. And the illustration, as simple as it is, I think really captures the action and the mood of the story itself pretty well. All right, now let's move forward about, well, more than 50 years now to 1992. And in 1960, since 1960, Bantam Books had been Louis L'Amour's primary publisher. And now, after his death in 1988, they were going to take some of his short stories. Some had been published and some had not been published. And their plan was to release them as audio, not audio books, but audio dramatizations. Before Louis L'Amour died, he stipulated that if these were going to be produced, he didn't want them to be produced as just audio books, as someone narrating the story or reading it aloud, but to be fully produced like the old radio dramas that he used to listen to in the 40s and 50s, those kinds of things with music and dialogue, and there's definitely some narration in it. But in releasing these as little audio cassettes, Bantam was having commissioned artwork for each of these individual short stories. This is something that rarely happened as far as cover art for short stories. You might have a collection of short stories and one of those stories would have an illustration. But in the case of these audio cassettes, all these short stories were getting their own full-blown cover art. And here is the cover art for that original 1992 cassette case. The artwork itself is not credited, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the artist is likely Steve Assel. It's exactly the type of formula that Assel fell back on that Beau L'Amour, Louis' son, Beau L'Amour, did not care for. And Beau L'Amour was kind of acting as de facto art director for a lot of these covers and art commissions after his father died, working directly with Bantam in a lot of cases. He did not oversee this one, but he talked about this is the type of artwork for his father's covers that he did not particularly care for. He much preferred the work of Greg Manchess, who he could art direct with directly, speak with him directly rather than having to go through Bantam's art department. And Manchess's artwork integrated the action from a specific scene from a given story into a cohesive setting. That's a story for another video, I guess. But what Beau did not care for was the system Assel used for dozens of Louis L'Amour covers for Bantam during a rebranding period in the early 90s. Now, granted, it does look pretty good. Assel would photograph his models dressed from Old West wardrobes and then paint them verbatim against a scene that had some kind of a Western background that he deemed appropriate for a given story. Beau's criticism is that the characters in the foreground rarely matched the background scene in mood or lighting. There was no interaction with the characters and the backgrounds, as though they were just kind of standing posing in front of a backdrop. Beau would complain that if something was off in the reference photo, it would just get copied right into the final painting without correction. And I think you can see that system in action in this particular cover here, or maybe I should say lack of action. There's just a static pose. And I would also say that having just read this story, the model here does not really seem to exemplify the character as depicted in the story. It's a pretty generic Western leading man here. Doesn't seem like Clip Haynes. Now, really, hardly anyone but a obsessive compulsive semi-retired art director like me cares about stuff like this. But for instance, Haynes should have 2 6-shooters like we talked about before, one on each hip. A detail like that is so simple to just address if anyone is caring to pay attention. I'm sure Beau L'Amour would have caught something like that. It doesn't really matter. It's still a nice cover. It certainly has that Louis L'Amour brand, that appearance, but the attention to the details here is, as an art director, what I like to see, and I think Beau would agree with me, so take that, Steve Assel. And now, speaking of models, another guess on my part is that Steve Assel used Jason Savas for the reference model here. I can't confirm that completely, but let's just say I was making a video someday about this artwork and I had to guess, I'd say it was Jason Savas. Savas did a lot of modeling work for paperback cover art through the 1980s and into the 90s, and is considered the primary successor to Steve Holland's rugged man of action legacy, who posed for probably most famously the Doc Savage paperbacks. Now, to be fair to Steve Assel, he was under tremendous pressure here. Bantam had commissioned him to paint dozens and dozens of Louis L'Amour covers. They were going through an effort at the time to rebrand the Louis L'Amour line. Louis had recently passed away, and so it was time to reissue and therefore recommission new artwork of a lot of the Louis L'Amour titles, and this cassette being one of those. So what he would do is he would work a lot with his favorite models, and he could get some photo studio time, dress his models up, and shoot a bunch of these reference photos in a day or two. And then he would have this catalog of new images that he could then project directly onto his canvas and paint exactly what the photo is on the canvas, and then go back and add in an appropriate background that he might pull from any number of other sources. In this case, he found a couple of Western buildings that looked like they might be part of the town that no guns could tame. And so that was the production build that he set up, and Assel was pretty good at it. It was not an uncommon system for other artists to use also. It's just a shame because Louis L'Amour's stories have so much action to it that you'd like the covers to convey that as well. Not that they don't look good, but they do have that thing that Beau L'Amour would talk about, where it looks like someone just posing in front of a backdrop, unfortunately. Lighting and things like that may not match. If there's something not quite right in the photo itself, artists like Steve Assel might not go in and correct it in the painting necessarily. But such was the life of living under such deadlines and production issues. All right, let's take one quick look at the 2 illustrations next to each other, and we can call it a day. So, ironically, in my opinion, as cheap and rough as the uncredited artwork for The Town No Guns Could Tame from New Western magazine, I much prefer that one to the static pose of the much more sophisticated audio cassette. That's just my own opinion. Comparing them side by side, I have to admit the Assel painting looks pretty good, if it is Steve Assel, and does have that Bantam L'Amour brand. I just don't think that it beats the New Western art for fun and all that action in the story. So let me know in the comments down below what you think. Do you prefer the cheaper, more rough and ready drawing from New Western magazine, or do you prefer the much more colorful and sophisticated yet static painting from the Bantam audio cassette? So let me know in the comments down below what you think, or if you're a Louis L'Amour fan like I am, have you got a favorite Louis L'Amour novel or a favorite short story or favorite cover art? Let me know. I know June on the Range is wrapping up here any minute now, but we can continue the conversation in the comments down below. It's always fun to do that. I want to thank Michael K. Vaughn and his posse of co-hosts. Again, I'll leave links to all their channels down below. And so until June on the Range rides again, keep your powder dry, and thanks for setting a spell with me.